Well, good afternoon. My name is Dr. Robert O'Neill. I'm here at Hazard Castle. I want to introduce you to that structure. I want to introduce you to Joseph P. Hazard, who built it, and I want to introduce you to the Hazard family, who's responsible for so much of the fabric of Narragansett, South County, in the state of Rhode Island. I've been asked to present this information by the Narragansett Historical Society. That's being shepherded and run by Shirley Eastham, who does a wonderful job. I'd like to start by introducing you to the Hazard name, which derives from the Arabic word hazar, and that is roughly translated as risk taker. The name first appears in England and France back in the 1200s, around the time of the Crusades. The progenitor of the Hazard family was born in 1610 in Wales, in Great Britain, and by 1630 had immigrated to the United States. A lot of people were immigrating to the United States at that time, particularly from England and Europe. In Europe, it was the 30 Years' War. In England, Elizabeth had just died. There was lots of turmoil and actually warfare, again, mostly on a religious basis. Everybody wanted to get out. Arriving here in about 1630, he was probably an indentured servant, meaning that it was very expensive to make the journey from Europe to the United States. And so that the majority of immigrants to the United States actually did indenture themselves to a person, a family, business in order to pay for the journey. By 1635, he's listed in Boston records as a free man. Subsequently, we know that he then moved as a surveyor, a carpenter builder, to the town of Newport, and was one of the 8 founders of the city of Newport in 1638. He was very successful, owned property in the Newport area, and his son Robert was extraordinarily successful, owning hundreds and hundreds of acres, both in the Newport area, but predominantly in South County. Property stretching from what's now the Bay Campus to actually URI, property including where we sit right now, spanning from the ocean to our right to Point Judith on our left. It was the second largest number of slaves who were located on this particular farming area. Robert's farming area. The largest actually was the Champlin family in Charlestown with roughly 200 slaves. It's estimated that Robert Hazard had somewhere in the range of 150 slaves. One of the great ironies of history is that a few generations later, it was his grandson who was responsible for the Emancipation Act in 1743, which basically freed the slaves in Rhode Island, but that's what happens with history. One of the reasons in 1743 that occurred was that Rhode Island, because of its position on religious liberty, was populated by a disproportionate number of Quakers who were very unwelcome in Massachusetts. The Puritans didn't like the Quakers. The Quaker religion started in roughly 1650 in England, and by the time we were in the 1700s in Rhode Island, on the voting rolls, roughly half of those people on the voting rolls identified themselves as being Quakers. And the interesting thing about the voting rolls, just to digress for a second, is that to be able to vote at that time in the colonies, you had to be 21, you had to be male, and you had to be a property owner. Interestingly, you didn't have to be white, so that for freed slaves who then owned property, a small number of them actually could vote. Slaves obviously mostly being from Africa, But what happened with King Philip's War in the 1670s, when the Wampanoags and Narragansetts and the Pequots were all defeated, majority of the men were shipped off to the West Indies to work on the plantations there so they wouldn't cause any more trouble. But a certain number of males, along with all the women and children, were then literally given over to the colonists to work as servants for that family. So to skip forward a few generations, we're now indeed in the mid-1700s, and we have someone named College Tom Hazard, named College Tom Hazard because he actually attended Yale for a year or two. And more importantly, he, along with 8 others, were the founders of Rhode Island College, which was the original name for Brown University. In addition to then founding that and also being responsible to a great extent for the Emancipation Act, he was a very busy preacher, farmer. I don't believe that he was actually involved in manufacturing, but they did, under his tutelage, start a process where materials were actually hand loomed, which was an interesting idea given what was going to subsequently happen with the development of mills in Rhode Island. College Tom's cousin was named Nailor Tom, N-A-I-L-O-R. The reason being is that he worked as a blacksmith, as well as a farrier, as well as a builder. And his journal, called the Blue Book, is a very nice way of seeing the day-to-day activities of what was happening in South County. His grandson, meaning College Tom's grandson, was then named Shepherd Tom. Shepherd Tom being called that because he raised sheep, but more importantly, he was responsible for reflections on olden days and the Johnny Cake papers. So from Robert, which is a slave owner, a large-scale farmer, you progress forward, and the next generation we want to focus on is actually the 6th generation. And in that generation, we now have College Tom's children. The main one we're going to focus on is Roland Hazard. Roland Hazard was a very adventurous entrepreneur, moved to Charleston to join his cousin, Robinson, and they were very much involved in the shipping and mercantile trade, and at that time probably also very much involved in the triangle trade, which involved molasses and involved slaves and transport of goods between Africa, England, and the United States and the West Indies. But in any case, Roland went off to Charleston, made his fortune, but unfortunately lost some of his fortune because the French confiscated 8 of his ships in a dispute, and as a result he returned here to his father's home, which is on Tower Hill, and actually it's located where all outdoors equipment is if you're driving on Route 1. And there was actually a cluster of 14 structures there, mostly homes, a tavern, also a Quaker meeting house, and the only real residual of it is a small cemetery that's located there. But Roland came back, he lived there for a while, and he wound up establishing the mills in Peacedale. The mills in Peacedale flourishing because now we're into the new equipment manufacturing. They got into manufacturing the rough cloth for the plantations in the South. Subsequently, they actually also manufactured the uniforms and blankets for the Union Army. So they didn't obviously take sides as to which manufacturing need they would support. They did take serious sides, which we'll get into, as to their position on the abolition of slavery in the United States. Roland was very successful. He had 7 children. The ones we're going to focus on are Roland Jr., if you will. It's actually Roland Gibson Hazard, along with his brother Isaac Hazard, along with Joseph Peace Hazard, who indeed was responsible for the structure that's behind us. The entity prospered. Joseph Peace Hazard was a bit of a dilettante and was more interested in travel in Europe, South America, spent a lot of time in London, in Italy. But in any case, the family prospered, and as a result, they had a lot of money, they had a lot of property. Remember, the Hazards started their purchasing of property in this whole area back in the 1660s. Well, now it's 1835 and Roland Hazard dies. Joseph Peace Hazard inherits 200 acres, basically bounded by the ocean. And to my left, Wandsworth Street, which runs between what's now called the Polo Club condominia and the Point Judith Golf Course. And to our south is Wordsworth, which is erroneously identified as Anna Olivo Court. 200 acres extending from the ocean almost to Salt Pond. The property adjacent, some of it went to his sister Elizabeth, some of it went to Isaac, so the property tended to stay pretty much in the family. Behind the camera is a small farmhouse, and it was there that Joseph Peace Hazard then moved to in 1835, and the first building in the complex here for the castle was actually completed in 1846. It's the hexagonal tower to our right, which was actually dedicated to his mother, who was Mary Peace, P-E-A-C-E, Hazard. The Hazard family in South Kingstown, not only being responsible for a sizable mill complex, they were also very generous to the community, donating what is now the Presbyterian Church that's there, the Guild, which was a gathering place for social and training activities, spectacular library. Subsequent generations were actually responsible for a beautiful Daniel Chester French bronze sculpture, the Weaver. Again, Daniel Chester French having been the individual who designed and sculpted the Lincoln Memorial, the statue of Lincoln seated. So the family was very generous. They were the first company in Rhode Island to get into profit sharing. And most importantly, for the development of the area, the brothers decided on bringing in a railroad spur from Kingston that led to their manufacturing complex, the mill. But they also had, another spur, actually 2, that came to Narragansett, one of which going to what is now Monaghan's Dock. And the idea of this was very practical. This is now in the 1860s. They intended to be able to get their manufactured goods to a major railroad line, which they then did with a spur, but they were also then able to bring their manufactured goods over to Monaghan's Dock and load on small ships, as well as far as distributing their products. In addition, however, they also brought a spur to Narragansett it was actually the same spur, but they had a couple of stops on it, one of which was to a large horse barn, which is where the junior high school is now, and also to a lovely structure that you see as an outline of a fairly large train station on Boone Street. It's been repurposed, the lower portion of it, for other businesses, but the train station is still there. Little remains of anything at Monaghan's Dock to suggest that that was there. So what you have is the practical effect of being able to distribute your goods in a very worthwhile, successful fashion. What it also resulted in, remember we're in the 1860s, 1870s, is that it enabled those individuals with some resources to be able to come to a very spectacular beach in Narragansett, and as a result, all of the very, very large hotels developed. Most of the people coming for as much as the summer, but frequently coming for a month at a time, because they would put their goods on in New York or Philadelphia, come to Kingston, and come to Narragansett. The idea of a horse barn along the way was because where we are now, and strictly speaking adjacent to us, where the Polo Club condominiums are, was a very, very large, well-known polo club. International matches were held there. It was actually pretty famous, and it appeared in, excuse me, all the New York and Philadelphia newspapers. While Narragansett never rivaled the cottages in Newport, it had quite a bit of cachet and was very appealing to people who are a little more low-key than the 500 or 100, whatever it was, who came up from New York to Newport. Interesting thing is that it's reputed that the robber barons in Newport used Narragansett for their mistresses, and they would come over on their boats, leaving their wives in Newport, and they would have their dalliances over in Narragansett. Whether that's entirely true or not, it's a little bit speculative. So we now have the beginnings of a very, very flourishing Narragansett beach area. McKim, Mead, and White are brought in to design the towers along with the casino adjacent to it, remembering that casino was a place for dining and entertainment. It didn't have anything to do with gambling at that time. Well, right then, meaning we're in the 1870s still, Joseph Peace Hazard and his sister Anna, again, who owned the property next door, along with Isaac, who was on the other side, decided that they were going to open up what we now call Ocean Road, and this obviously resulted in some fairly spectacular mansions being built as you headed down south on Ocean Road from Narragansett Beach area towards the point, what's now the Point Judith Light area. The contributions, therefore, of the brothers Hazard, Joseph included, obviously made it possible for the completion of the Narragansett area as a very, very significant resort adventure for people from New York and Philadelphia in particular. Well, to bring things back to Joseph Peace Hazard, a very fascinating individual, born in 1807, again inherited the 200-acre farm here, typically called Seaside, but occasionally called Seaview. Born in 1807, inherited the property in 1835, moved to the farmhouse in 1846. Moved to the farmhouse shortly thereafter, and in 1846 had completed the first of the multiple buildings that were joined together. Most of the architecture here he designed. Later on, his niece Abby was responsible for some of the later structures. Joseph Peace Hazard, initially part of the Peacedale manufacturing, but subsequently really preferred to travel. Did a lot of horticulture work here, was responsible as an arborist for a lot of the tree placements. Eventually, they wound up bringing in Frederick Law Olmsted to help with the design of the designs on the property. He himself, he traveled everywhere, knew everyone. Ralph Waldo Emerson, Daniel Webster, the Brownings. He knew everyone and did everything. Interestingly, there are stories of him crossing the Brooklyn Bridge when it was simply a wooden structure. At the time, if you had money and you had the time and interest, you could be everywhere. In building the structures here, the very interesting event that happened to him was that in the 1850s, he became exposed to spiritualism in Boston. Remember that spiritualism started in the about 1844 in western New York State with two young Quaker sisters who were sure that they were communicating with the spirits through a rapping on the table in response to answering questions. For whatever reason, this became a fairly acceptable thing, particularly those of a Quaker background. Joseph Peace Hazard and his brother, who was Shepherd Tom that I mentioned, were very, very much committed to the spiritualism. The one aside that I would like to just mention here, lest I forget it, is that while his brothers were more interested in manufacturing, that being Roland and Isaac, one of their very, very important, serious, worthwhile endeavors was they were very much responsible for the beginnings of the Republican political party, and they were very, very much a part of the drafting of Abraham Lincoln to run for the presidential office. Joseph Peace Hazard was sort of interested, but he actually was more interested in spiritualism. And when he then progressed from the initial hexagonal tower that he built as a memorial to his mother, Mary Peace, he progressed with these larger structures. Again, a little bit of a digression. Because his mother was Mary Peace, P-E-A-C-E, we actually have now Peacedale. Because his brother's daughter was named Carolina, we have Carolina. Because his mother in her adolescence stayed with the Wakefield family in Kendal, England, we have Wakefield, Rhode Island. Carrying these names forward, we'll see as we look at the structures behind me that the 105-foot tower has a memorial plaque there with the names Peace, Gibson, Robinson, and Hazard. Hazard is obvious. Peace being Mary Peace, Joseph Peace Hazard's mother. Mary Peace, her mother was a Gibson. The Gibson family then having its affluence, the result of plantations in Barbados and the West Indies. And then Robinson, because this was the name of College Tom, who was Joseph Peace Hazard's grandfather. His wife was a Robinson. The Robinson name is a well-known name, different streets named Robinson Street. But one of the very interesting things is that off of South Ferry Road is the Hannah Robinson House, which is a wonderful, well-kept, maintained, restored colonial structure that actually has as part of it the area where the slave quarters were. And the Hannah Robinson House is so named because of a tragic story of homeschooling that didn't go well. Hannah Robinson was homeschooled. She fell in love with her teacher. She wanted to run off with him. Her father said no. She ran off anyway and lived in poverty because the music teacher, language teacher, decided that he didn't love her as much if she didn't come with her father's fortune. In any case, we have a location by the tower, wooden observation tower, where 138 crosses Route 1. The nearby is the Hannah Robinson Rock, which is supposedly where Hannah Robinson returned from Providence destitute and basically dying and hoping that her father would take her back. But the Hannah Robinson House, which I mentioned, is a well-maintained, beautiful, large colonial home. And interestingly, it's actually lived in and cared for by members of the Hazard family. So there are these tie-ins that keep repeating themselves. In terms of Joseph Peace Hazard, I reflected one of the interesting items that serves to identify him and characterize him is a very extensive journal that he kept regards to his expenditures on this estate in terms of cost of lumber, the efforts he made to bring in the trees, as I mentioned later on, incorporating advice from Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. Jr. But one of the little asides was that his haircuts, now this would take us back to roughly the 1820s, 1830s, his haircut would cost him 6 cents, and it was given to him by a barber named Lunt, who lived in Kingston, who was actually George Washington's barber during the Revolutionary War, or so we're told. So as we focus on Joseph Peace Hazard and his various efforts here, and I mentioned that it's the 1850s and he becomes involved in spiritualism, he not only becomes involved and a believer in it, but he actually, along with one of his brothers, spends considerable time authoring articles and going about and giving lectures about the validity of spiritualism. An interesting aside is the two sisters who were responsible for the beginnings of spiritualism, excuse me, back in the 1840s, actually recanted and said it was all a hoax in the 1880s, but people like Joseph Peace Hazard didn't accept that. His way of communicating included the tapping issue on tables, but interestingly also he was able to communicate with the spirits he thought by virtue of things that his chiming pocket watch did. Not exactly quite sure how that worked, but again, that was his belief. It was his belief in spiritualism that resulted in the placing of a well to our west, and adjacent to it in 1884, the building of a structure called Druid's Dream. It was built as a guest house for those individuals who were visiting him here. And again, the location was supposedly given to him by a dream that he had about the Druids. I would take a minute just to introduce some information about the Druids. The Druids were a polytheistic group of individuals who occupied northern France and parts of England. The result of their presence and beliefs in England is Stonehenge, in France is Karnak, and again they arranged stones in various patterns, probably relating to the seasons and lighting, etc. But they had no written language. As a result, when the Romans then occupied England and France, their values and terminology and various gods sort of got absorbed into Roman culture, and because they had no written language, there really isn't an accurate assessment of what all their beliefs were and what their rituals were. However, as we get into the late 1800s, there was a movement in the United States and in Europe called Romanticism, and the idea of Druid priests leading pure lives and making sacrifices was very appealing, and as a result books were written, an opera was written, plays were written, all portraying things which really no one knew anything about because there was no written record of it. But the idea of Druids was very, very popular. In addition to constructing what we refer to as Druid's Dream, a lovely stone structure on Gibson to our west, across the street from that, on this Kendall Green area, Joseph Peace Hazard decided that he was going to build a site for his burial and construct a memorial column surrounded by 8 stone pillars, 4 of which had concavities that would hold water for the birds. He also brought a very large stone from the seashore that was in the form of a chair, and he would go there to reflect on nature and the birds that were in the bird bath. And indeed, in the center of it was a sizable obelisk-like structure with commentary about life generally, and under this is where he was supposed to be buried. But in fact, when he died, the family moved the stone to his brother's estate property in Portsmouth called Vaucluse, V-A-U-C-L-U-S-E, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. That particular estate house no longer exists. The small burial area with 14 stones is probably on private property, may not be really accessible, but is something that we're intending to look into. To come back to the main house, which he built over probably 30 years, it included some interesting things. Obviously, he had to have a seance room. The remarkable thing about that is that he not only had one here, but he had one at Druid's Dream. And when the church, the Diocese of Rhode Island, purchased the property in the 50s, one of the things that they did here as well as in Druid's Dream is that they kind of looked at these a little differently, and actually on this property they held at least one exorcism to make sure that there wasn't any kind of spirit that might pose a problem for the retreatants who lived here. At the time that Joseph Peace Hazard lived here, there were actually spook, S-P-O-O-K, holes in the downstairs walls where he would set out food and drink for the spirits when they came to visit. Needless to say, there was some controversy within the family about him and his brother as to whether they were totally sane, but his general gracious manner to visitors and to friends was such that everybody sort of tolerated it, and they just considered him eccentric. Time went by, and Joseph Peace Hazard fell into ill health. The property itself was reasonably well maintained, but economics became a factor. And as the property changed hands, it was less well cared for, and a new group of family members came, and the interior, which had been late Victorian Queen Anne in the 1920s, was changed to be a colonial and Spanish revival, losing a lot of the fixtures and changing quite a few of the rooms. In addition, back in the 1920s, to the southwest of us, a cow barn with a second story was repurposed. They didn't have much need for cows, and they now had cars. And as a result, the second floor was removed, and the front had brick pillars that were added, and now it became the garage for cars that were used on the property. Otherwise, on the property, the major changes occurred in the 1930s, because with the hurricane of 1938, almost the entire property was leveled, so that most of the spectacular plantings, various maple, oak, beech trees, were lost. Such a large amount of which resulted in the beginnings of Arnold Lumber out in West Kingston. It wasn't called Arnold Lumber. It was actually started by one of the Hazard family members. Subsequently, obviously, it's been developed and added to. So the reflection for Joseph P. Hazard is that with his brothers, he contributed significantly to the development of Narragansett with bringing in the railroad spurs, through his friendships with various individuals and also, excuse me, significant businessmen and bankers such as Joseph Dulles in the Philadelphia area. Narragansett was able to develop its beach, it was able to develop its casino, it was able to develop its hotels. And because of Joseph P. Hazard and his family members, Ocean Road was open, and we then had developed the various mansions that belonged to R.G. Dunn of Dunn and Bradstreet, the Wanamaker from Philadelphia, Wanamaker family from Philadelphia, as well as a number of other individuals. Unfortunately, as we get into the 1900s, the Hazard family had less impact, and the successful family members got involved in what's called the Solvay process from Scandinavia, which is a chemical process that actually evolved into Allied Chemical and was moved to New York State. One other interesting aside about the Hazard family as we get into the 1900s is that during the Second World War, during the Blitz in England, most of the children actually were shipped out of London because of the fire bombs. And the families that lived in what's presently the Oaks in Peacedale, as well as the family that lived here, they actually took children from London and they lived here during the war. And as a matter of fact, in the Joseph P. Hazard house behind me, they actually had a small school that they ran for the children of these families in England. Obviously, there being a long-standing relationship of the Hazard family and subsequent generations, particularly during the Revolutionary War, some of which were loyalists, most were revolutionaries, that they continued to have significant ties with England, and as a result then they were generous and kind enough to import these poor children whose families were at risk in London during the Blitz. A number of famous and near famous cousins of the Hazard family are too long to really introduce all of them. Certainly one of the most recognizable is Oliver Hazard Perry, his father being a Perry, his mother being a Hazard. But again, numerous individuals contributing to the arts, contributing to science, being involved in politics, as I mentioned, Pulitzer Prize in poetry, among other things. One of the nice things is that there is an Oliver Hazard Perry house in South Kingstown, which has been reasonably well cared for. There's also a very interesting plaque in the South Kingstown Town Hall, which lists all of the individuals who fought during the Civil War. A very large number of them were Hazards. A pleasant place to walk through is the cemetery behind the Wakefield branch, which is now called Arnold's on Main Street. That cemetery has a number of the gravestones and family burial sites of the Hazard family. Actually, then remnants of the Hazard family are everywhere. It's just that you have to look a little bit more carefully in order to find them. Subsequently, there are Hazard family members here, but mostly for vacations. There are black Hazard family members that go back, obviously, to some of the slaves, and their presence is a reflection of our South County history. So with that, I'd like to again summarize by saying you've met Joseph P. Hazard, a fascinating eccentric. You've met his family, which is significantly responsible for a lot of Rhode Island history. and you've gotten to see Hazard Castle, which is a remarkable set of structures and buildings, which is now being presently maintained and enhanced actually by Middlebridge School, which is a private high school that's doing a wonderful job with the property. Thank you all.